That was quite a thought. Well, according to the communications, the coming together of Bobby, Phyllis and Andrea had not been a matter of chance. If he was destined to play a part himself, and this visit was part of a plan, then the planners must have conceived the May Lectures project to bring him and Andrea together. He could have sworn it had been his own idea, but the way the theme and timing of the May Lectures coincided with the nature and development of Bobby's healing powers made him wonder. Jim Hurtak could be part of the plan, too. Certainly the weeks he had spent with Jim Hurtak the year before had contributed a lot towards preparing him psychologically for the present situation and ensuring that he wouldn't be immediately thrown by it. Hurtak, who had held the post of Professor of Oriental Studies at the California Institute of the Arts at Valencia, was not so much a teacher as an experience, a guru figure whose teaching was not an explanation of objective reality but a spontaneous creation of ideas and experiences that made his students explore new areas for themselves and in themselves. Dressed always in a crumpled suit and wearing a black beret perched on the back of his head, Hurtak held classes which sometimes ran as long as 8 hours, during which he would alternate between reading long passages of scripture and delivering rambling commentaries on them. The commentaries were always fascinating and provocative, but how they were connected with the readings was a mystery to John. He sometimes spoke about UFOs and about his personal contacts with extraterrestrials, who, he said, had often intervened in Earth history since prehistoric times, when they had first established a civilization in the Tarim Basin to the north of Tibet. Many of his students recorded his every word, except on occasions when he made them turn off their machines while he gave them some devastating piece of cosmic news that only he was privy to and which he said he was now allowed to share with them. John recalled his first meeting with this strange man, when he had gone along uninvited, unannounced and unknown to one of his classes and was greeted by the professor with a vigorous handshake and the words, "Good. You've come. I was expecting you." After that he had become a disciple, regularly attending his classes and joining the groups he took on weekend field trips, sometimes visiting scientific research establishments, where they were often unaccountably rather coolly welcomed, and on other occasions going to some power spot where they would meditate or listen to Jim preach. It was one of these field trips that had finally led to his moving on from the Hurtak experience. They left Valencia at dawn in several cars and drove for several hours before turning onto a sandy track. This led at last to a white domed building surrounded by a barbed wire fence on which hung a sign that read, "College of Universal Wisdom." A mile or two beyond this they came to a run-down dessert cafe where Jim introduced them to a gray-haired, stocky man named George Van Tassel, who was the presiding genius of this desert ashram and presumably the possessor of universal wisdom, though on this occasion he didn't dispense much of the latter commodity but talked at length about his contacts with UFOs. Then in the stifling heat of the desert afternoon the groups that perched some 20 feet up on some rocks in a semicircle around Jim, who regaled them with an unabridged reading of the book of Isaiah. At dusk they all traipsed deep into the desert on foot to a spot that Jim said was special, though nobody else could tell how it differed from any other sandy waste, and Jim recited a Hebrew incantation which he said would summon UFOs. As the sky got darker and the stars brighter, Jim hailed a distant moving light in the sky as their first UFO sighting. Then other members of the party began to see them too, and to utter appropriate expressions of rapture and awe, but try as he may John couldn't convince himself that they weren't normal aerial phenomena. He had stopped being a disciple of Jim Hurtak's after that experience, but he had remained grateful to him for the expansion of awareness and the sense of the existence and importance of non-ordinary realities that being exposed to the Hurtak personality for 2 months had given him, and he retained a suspicion that Jim as guru had his own ways of disengaging his disciples when their time to move on had come, and that the last field trip he had participated in had perhaps not been as mad and unscheduled as it had appeared at the time. And now it seemed that the Jim Hurtak episode was fitting in with the unfolding pattern of his life. He remembered that in the conversation over dinner Lyle had asked Andrea whether he had checked out the geographical coordinates that had been given in the communication Phyllis had channeled as the location of the space being's first landing on Earth. Andrea said he had, and it turned out to be a place called the Tarim Basin, which was to the north of Tibet. This correspondence with Jim Hurtak's information could hardly be put down to either coincidence or contrivance, and it was one of the first things that disposed John to believe that the communications might really be from an extraterrestrial intelligence. After a short and fitful sleep, John awoke to the sound of voices downstairs. Dressed only in underpants, he went sleepily down to the kitchen to see what was happening, and was greeted with laughter by Andrea, Phyllis, Bobby, and some other members of the household who were sitting around talking and smoking. He gathered that Bobby and one of the girls had been up in the woods together and had an experience. Well, that's nothing unusual, he thought, but it turned out that they were talking about something else, and now Bobby suggested that they should all return to the spot together, so they all went and put on warm clothes because there was a chill in the night air, and 10 minutes later they were crashing through the woods up the hillside towards the mysterious tower. The time was 3:15, the night was still and brightly moonlit, and at intervals there was a sound like the hooting of an owl. The atmosphere was certainly eerie, but so far as John was concerned the nature of the experience they were supposed to be having remained a mystery. Bobby told them all to wander ground and pick a spot that felt comfortable. Comfortable for what? He wanted to ask, but he didn't want to spoil it for anyone else, so he found a comfortable tree to lean against, and waited to see what would happen next. About half an hour passed in silence, then they reassembled, summoned by a few shouts, and trekked back to the house. Returning to the kitchen, they sat and talked about what it had all meant. Bobby certainly seemed to be profoundly moved. For John it had been too reminiscent of one of Jim Hurtake's crazy excursions. He returned to bed cold and confused, and this time slept deeply and long. The following morning he wished he hadn't left the gathering so soon, because apparently shortly after his departure Bobby had fallen into trance and a communication had taken place. In it, Andrea said, there had been a strong intimation that John was to be the third member of the team. John was disappointed to have missed that, but he didn't have to wait long for a repeat performance. That evening he, Andrea, Phyllis and Bobby went to Andrea's room, and after Andrea had spent some time tinkering with complicated recording equipment and setting up an infrared camera, the lights were turned low and Bobby settled in a wooden armchair facing the three of them. Slowly he began to count backwards from 31, and before he reached 10 his voice was barely audible and he was slumped heavily. Then his head rose and he appeared to be having some difficulty with his breathing, but Andrea and Phyllis showed no concern, so John assumed that all was well. "We welcome you," said Andrea, after a pause. "We come in love," said Bobby, hesitatingly. A shiver ran down John's spine. The idea that these words might have originated in a source beyond Earth, or in another dimension, was awesome. Korean began by referring to a message for Bobby which, apparently, had been communicated the previous night but Phyllis had neglected to pass on to him, although she had promised to do so. Phyllis explained that although they all remembered that there had been a message, it hadn't been on the tape when they played it back. "We did not ask the message to be taped, we asked you to deliver the message," Korean said. Phyllis apologized, and Korean went on, "We do not ask for your apology. We only ask that this time you will keep your word." So gentle, so loving, but firm as a rock, John thought. He was already impressed. This brief initial exchange implied that Korean knew that the message hadn't been delivered, and therefore must have had Phyllis and Andrea under observation since last night's communication, and also that it had the ability to interfere with the tape recording process, presumably by stopping the tape running whenever there was something to communicate which it didn't want recorded. Korean then announced that some more work was going to be done on Bobby, and that Phyllis should describe what she saw. Andrea asked, and was granted, permission to take infrared pictures. Then Phyllis began to describe another weird operation in which silver rods and balls went into Bobby's body and there was wiring all over his face. John could see nothing, nor, he suspected, could Andrea, though he was snapping away with his infrared camera as fast as he could. Phyllis had moved forward a little and apparently encroached on Bobby's aura, for Korean said do not touch. Then 5 minutes or so passed in silence and Korean announced that Bobby's breathing would have to be stopped for the next part of the adjustment, and to John's amazement Bobby abruptly stopped breathing and remained immobile and breathless for what seemed an age but turned out to be just 45 seconds. Then he resumed breathing and Korean, speaking through him, got down to the business of the evening. "We feel the three we ask for may be assembled. We feel you have done extremely well with no more help than you have asked for. Please do not touch. We feel you have talked. We feel there is a decision the three must agree before we may continue. We feel you have come a long way to reach this decision. John, you are not aware that we speak to you." "No, I wasn't," said John in a small voice, momentarily thrown by being unexpectedly addressed by name. "We feel you three are what we asked to be assembled. Korean went on. We ask that you harmonize, agree on a direction, on a director. Then we may complete our third meeting. We ask that you three sit as one and agree. You want us to make that decision now, Korean, said Phyllis. We ask that a talk. We wish you to take all the time you need to make this decision. So it was decided that the three should adjourn for their discussion, and Korean said that while they were having it, Bobby should ponder the message, which was now repeated and went: to give in humility and to receive in humility is the same. One without the other has no meaning and no purpose. It is no greater to receive in humility and no lesser to receive than to give. We leave now, in love, said Korean, and Bobby began to count up out of trance. He opened his eyes, rubbed his hands and looked at them. They felt like wax, he said. He had feelings of tingling, burning and stiffness in various parts of his body. He pulled up his shirt. There was a red mark and a bump on his chest, and what looked like a bunch of pin pricks where Phyllis had earlier described silver wires going into his body. Andrea repeated the message about giving and receiving in humility, and elaborated on the theme a bit to be sure that Bobby understood its implications. He did, and he was moved. He said, "Last night on the hill, I was trying so hard to find the words to tell. I wanted to give something, I wanted just to give. And it's like that. These things and people really embarrass me. They say that was really wise, what you said, or that was really great, what you did. I can't even take credit for being alive. How can I possibly take credit for any of this, for anything I say? I really feel like it's not me saying this because I'm not intelligent enough to say anything that would have any real meaning. I realize that it's not me doing any of this, and I don't really want anyone to say thank you. It embarrasses me, because I know who they should be thanking, and it's embarrassing that they don't know who to thank." After some more discussion of the message and its meaning, they left Andrea's room and went down to the kitchen. At the top of the stairs, Bobby stopped. "My leg feels different," he said. "It feels like it's not mine." He poked his hip with his fingers. "It's me up here," he said, then moved his finger down a couple of inches, "but not here." This was his right leg, which had been injured in an accident, and he had been having some pain in it. He tried it out on the first stairs, then ran down the rest. "It feels great," he said with excitement. In the kitchen he sat down and rolled up his trouser leg. He looked at his knee and said incredulously, "I have a new leg. There used to be a scar here and it's gone." It was obviously an emotional moment for him and not an appropriate one to ask the question that John would have dearly liked answered. Had anyone else known about the scar? Would there, perhaps, be some hospital record of it? Andrea, Phyllis and John had their discussion, which was chiefly about the question of commitment. They shared their thoughts and feelings, both the emotions and the doubts that the situation aroused in them, and John was reassured to find that the others felt about it much as he did. Bobby was recalled and through him contact was re-established with Korean. Andrea reported, "Our decision was in the affirmative, to go ahead and do all that is necessary. The direction we have chosen is to help Bobby along the areas which have been indicated with his conscious, his physical, his subconscious, and all the things that go to make up his life, to keep him in good form, in harmony and happiness, while he does his work. We intend to carry his work to parts of the earth, and to those people who should know about it, in order that proof may be given, so that people may accept your coming and your presence. We realize that, sooner or later, we will have further discussions and you will inform us about your plans, and we expect, of course, to meet your people, or people from your part. We expect further plans to develop, and we are prepared to follow these out. We have decided rather quickly and easily that I should carry on as the director, based largely on my experience in this sort of situation. That is, in substance, what we have come to, in complete harmony, and our faith, I'm sure, will grow as we ourselves get stronger in our knowledge and our convictions and in our actual operations." Korean has just one small objection to this statement. As the partnership was now cemented and formally entered into, it was not appropriate for Andrea to speak of your plans, meaning Korean's. We ask that this part be changed to our plans. "We accept that as a very beautiful gesture," said Andrea. Korean said, "We come to you with love. We ask much of you, we are now one. We are very happy with the results, with the decision, with the harmony of the major three. And we thank you." The session ended with an exchange of thanks, mutual compliments and assurances. "This is not the last meeting," said Korean. "There will be more when they are needed. We will meet again in love." It was an emotional moment. John felt moved to say, "I don't know how to thank you enough for the extraordinary honor you have given us to be a part of this." But even as he spoke the words, the thought popped into his mind: if this is a hoax by spirits, they must be convulsing themselves at this moment. The spirit hoax hypothesis was his main residual doubt, but it was overwhelmed by the thought that if it were not the explanation, then this was surely the most exciting project to be engaged in on the entire planet at this time.